Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to say a few words today. And this is a hard topic. I appreciate, though, the opportunity to address it. And it's going to sound academic somewhat, what I have to say, because of the topic itself. But again, I always enjoy opportunities to speak, especially here, because this is a very, very special place for us, and we always like an opportunity to do anything that will help. Exerting leadership. That's really something that is hard to put your arms around. And before I talk about doing that, what you do to exert leadership, I want to say some things about leadership in general that I think that we often don't understand, and that's probably part of the reason that we have problems in that area sometimes. Leadership is the process of leading. It's motivating others to act or perform to achieve desired results. It's one of a number of management traits. The leader is one who leads. There's no single set of traits that define a leader. There are many different types of leaders. Leaders thrive depending on the situation that they're in many times. So although there's a core group of traits, there are many things about leading that depend on the situation. But the bottom line is you're a good leader if you can get the job done effectively. That's the bottom line. And we often mistake management and leadership. If you look at companies, corporations, look at J.C. Corporation right now. That company is tanking, and they brought a guy in who was a, quote, outstanding manager. And he has run it into the ground. In 1 year, they've lost 30% of their revenue, and they'll probably not recover from it. And he's a classic case of a person who had worked his way through the ranks in another organization under a good leader, but not the leader himself. And when he was allowed to lead, he managed and didn't lead, and they failed. So we have to make a distinction between those two things. Managers plan, managers organize, managers evaluate, managers direct, and if they're good managers, they'll lead too. But you can manage without leading. And that's why you see the mediocrity across our country today, is we've taught management over and over and over again, and we've gotten away from leadership. Another thing that you have to understand with leadership is the connection between power and responsibility and leading. You have to put those together properly. And leaders have to have lots of power. But we often think of leaders having power if they have position power. And that's the weakest leadership power that you can have. You can have power because of influence. That's the greatest. Look at Hitler. He was an unbelievable leader, believe it or not, Adolf Hitler. He was a person that had persuasive power. Now, he had military power, but he didn't start out with that. He started out with nothing. Look at Gandhi. Gandhi had absolutely no position power whatsoever. He had persuasive power. If you look back through history and our presidents through the years, through my lifetime, our greatest presidents are presidents who led because of their influence and because of the quality of the things they proposed to do, and not by position power. Our current president is relying totally on position power. He's using everything that he can use that gives the office of the president power to take the country in the direction that he wants it to go. He uses money to take it in the direction he wants it to go. And those are all weak ways to lead. But when you have influence because of the quality of what you're trying to do, then you'll become a great leader. But if we want to narrow this down a little bit, we want to narrow it down to look at leadership in a Christian context. And that's very, very different than any other place, because in Christianity we're dealing completely with volunteers, people who are functioning and doing what they're doing because they choose to, and they can quit anytime they want to. And that's true on almost every aspect of the operation of things that go with church. This school, congregations of the church, and all cooperative work. So leaders in the world that we live in and work in and try to do what we do in have to have lots of influence power. You have to be able to influence people, not with your position, but with your charisma, we would say, or with your expertise, with your example, that sort of thing. The Bible is full of examples of great leaders. Some of the judges were unbelievable leaders. David was a great leader. Solomon. Contrast David with Saul. Saul was a terrible leader. David was a good leader. We usually think Saul was tall and handsome and strong and mighty, and David was little and frail and meek. But the great leader was David, you see. So many times things that we think make you a leader don't do it. Joshua, a tremendous leader, a field general, a leader in every way that we can think about a leader. But then there's Moses. Look at what Moses did. There's scarcely a person, there are very few people in history who could have achieved what Moses did, and he couldn't even speak to the people. He didn't have the ability to do public speaking, and yet what a powerful leader he was. Abraham, Joseph are good leaders. And many times we can understand how to lead by looking. When the Lord wanted us to understand faith, He gave us Hebrews chapter 11, which is just filled with the names of people that we can go back. It's not a chapter that defines and explains and expounds upon faith. It tells us who were people of faith. And so when we think about leading, think about great leaders, Peter and John and Paul, and of course Christ Himself. They were leaders. What made all of these godly leaders great? They had a true, deep, unwavering faith in God. They trusted His instruction. They were willing to sacrifice themselves for the cause. They were willing to work hard. They were honest, courageous, godly, honorable. They had the capacity to repent. They had humility, patience, and they were considerate of others. Most of the time, leaders in a biblical context are organized thinkers. There is scholarship involved in leadership, especially in the arena that we're in, the religious Christian arena. Leaders have to be able to manage time and task. You sometimes have charismatic leaders who are pretty poor managers, but you'll eventually fail if you don't have the ability to manage some of these things, and time is one of them, and organizing task is another. Good leaders build networks of whatever it takes to support what they're doing. Networks of people, networks of other linkages with organizations, that sort of thing. Good leaders are inspirational. They cause you to want to move. They cause you to be motivated. And in the church, all of us are leaders. We are told that we will be few, and that our job as the Lord's church is to do what? Lead the effort to take the gospel to the whole world. And as I said the other day, there's about 7 million members of the church in the world, and there's about 7 billion people in the world. And so we have a tremendous task before us. We're a particular type of leader. We're called light, and we're called salt there in Matthew, which implies simplicity and commonness about our leadership as Christians. Most of the time when we talk about leadership in the church, we think automatically about elders and preachers. And they do have specific leadership responsibilities. And many times in churches, those offices are filled with people who try to lead like we do in other organizations, and you'll totally fail if you do that. So you have to go back to looking at biblical things like shepherd and presbyter and elder and those kinds of things to understand what it takes to lead in a church situation in those specific leadership roles. In church, we have very little position leadership at all. It's almost all influence leadership. We certainly don't have the ability to procure power in the church. We don't have any money. We don't have any way to offer money, although in the denominational world, they're buying members many times with country club environments and stuff like that. But that's rare, and we won't be able to do that. We shouldn't do that. And of course, the best leaders are those who learn how to follow Christ. Our mission is an unbelievably important and overpowering mission when we think about it, and we do need leaders in the church to motivate brethren to do what we've got to do, taking the gospel to the whole world. We need leaders who have vision, who can communicate their vision, and we need leaders in the church who have respect for the guidance of the Scripture. And we're desperately in need of that today. We're getting away from it so much. So, how do you, with all that's just background stuff, how do you exert leadership? If you're in any position, you're the preacher somewhere, you want to lead. You want to cause people to do what? To love God, to obey God, to learn more, to be evangelistic. You're an elder in the congregation. What do you want to do? You want to lead that congregation to carry out the things that it should do. You're a missionary, whatever. Number one, accept the responsibility for what it is that you're supposed to be doing. Understand your job and accept that responsibility. Be willing to sacrifice to do it. Realize that you cannot compel or coerce people. If you want to exert leadership in the church and you start trying to use muscle any way you can create it, you're going to fail. All you're going to do is cause everybody that's where you are to go somewhere else. And they'll do it. And you don't have to worry. And there's not any arena that we work in. The same thing is true in the mission field. We just cannot use force. We have no position power whatsoever in our work. We lead by motivating through inspiration. We motivate people to want to go to heaven. We motivate people to want to serve. We motivate people by helping them to understand what happens when you're faithful. And when you're faithful, you can get rest. You can get peace. When you're faithful, you can be at peace with God. And when people see you at peace, and when they see you in faithfulness, being a good example, then that's the most inspiring, motivating thing that you can do. And so we exert power by being good examples that results in motivation of others to do things. We have to be communicators. We have to have a vision that we communicate. You know what my vision is. I'm a missionary. You know what my whole thrust in life is all about. So you can see that, and you have to be able to see beyond that it can be done. You have to see some results. And if people are going to follow you very far, they've got to see that you have goals and objectives, and that there has to be consequences that are good when you succeed. Those things all have to be there. So to exert leadership, getting back, you've got to be a communicator. You've got to, the only way you can cause leadership to happen, exert leadership in our world, is always give all the credit for all that happens to somebody else. The first class I took at Heritage in 1976, in the fall of 1976, at the old building over there, Cecil May taught that class, and he spent one whole night, we came once a week, talking about this thing right here. And he said that's probably the most important thing of all, is we try to do what we do, is to find a way in everything to give all the credit to somebody else, and communicate that. And I have found that to be very effective. As we work in the mission field, we work with many people across the world in foreign countries, and missionaries typically are kind of authoritarian and very directive, and the nature of what you're doing has a tendency to cause you to be that way. You're going onto the battlefield. You know, the most authoritarian leaders we have are military people. Well, that's, you know, when you go onto the mission field, you're going onto the battlefield, and you've got a lot of hostile forces around you. You may have a hostile government to deal with, and you've got hostile religions to deal with. And so there's a tendency for us to become very authoritarian, very directive. It's real hard not to do that. But when you do, you never ever have any ownership of what's being done on the part of the people that you work with. And so you have to stay there forever. That's why you hear stories of missionaries that go to a place and they stay there for a lifetime, and when their life is over, they leave and they come home, and they leave about the same number of people that are faithful believers as there were the first year they were there, because they were forced into being authoritarian, directive leaders in the situation that they were in, and the people automatically just fell right in line behind that, quote, leadership, and they stayed that way throughout their entire time. So you have to know how to empower others. You do that by giving them credit. You do that by developing them. You do that by building teams and teaching people how to work with one another, how to cooperate. You do that by knowing what you're doing. Influence comes many times because of expertise. And you see that here in our own country. People, they want to see the preacher when they're sick. They want the preacher to come when they have a child born. They want the preacher when there's a crisis in their life. Why? Because that's a time when things are not going right, and they feel vulnerable, and they want a holy man. They want somebody there that's in touch with more than just what's of this world. And so that expertise in spiritual matters gives preachers a lot of power, you see. And so take advantage of that, but know what you're doing. Know what you can't fake it. You can't pretend to know when you don't know, all those kinds of things. But it'll give you, you can exert leadership if you have the expertise, the expert power. You know, you've heard the joke many, many times, an expert is a person who's more than 50 miles away from home with a briefcase. And I worked for the federal government for 25 years, and I often went on missions for the government, took distant places, sometimes the other side of the world, and I always had that briefcase. That would qualify me as an expert, whether I was or not. You actually, if you can be billed as one, you're halfway through the battle. To exert leadership, you have to have the capacity to adjust your course and change. You have to be able to do that. And if you're a leader, if you're in that place, and I bet Dennis Jones can probably tell all this stuff I'm telling better than I can, but if you're in that position where you're leading something and you can't change, people pick up on that. And they see you drifting off track, and when you can't bring it back on course, and that's not easy to do, because whatever direction you're going in has got all of these forces behind it, these resources, these people with buy-in to what you're trying to do. You can't just come over here. When you come over here, you're going to make a whole lot of people angry over here, but you've got to be able to do it. That's where the capacity to influence, the capacity to inspire people, the capacity to communicate gives you power to make those changes, you see. And so as a leader, you've got to be able to coach, to counsel, to encourage. You've got to be known as a hard worker. Leaders are born on the battlefield. A person, you don't just emerge as a leader in anything through training. The only way you can lead is to be on the field. And when you get on the field and in the battle, that's where you learn who they are. Wayne probably knows this. In World War II, when we were bombed in Pearl Harbor, and we knew that we were going to be in the war, 85% of our leadership in the military was replaced. All the generals, colonels, high-level officers in our military, 85% of them were replaced because they could not lead in battle. They couldn't lead in battle. And there were people who were moving up the ranks at just unbelievably rapid paces, because when we first started engaging, it was easy to tell. And so you'll never be a leader. You'll never be able to exert any force until you go to the field and get involved. And we need that today. We need to go to the field because we're losing ground. The church is shrinking. The population of the world is growing at 10 times the pace that we're growing worldwide. And you can just go on and on with facts that indicate that as people who are supposed to be leading the world in understanding how to respond appropriately to our Creator, we're not succeeding. We're not leading. And so we've got to look for ways to do this. And most who try to engage in leadership usually end up managing. I want to stress that again. Don't make the mistake of confusing those two things. We have lots of managers in what we're trying to do in the church, and we need leaders. I'm going to stop there. I guess I got a minute left. If there's a question or comment, I'll take it. Thank you. Hope that helped a little bit. And maybe we can all do a better job of exerting leadership as we carry out our various functions in the Lord's church.